who's going to be talking to you about Agile, giving you a whirlwind tour of this new environment. Some of you may have heard of it. A lot of you are going to be in it. We just want to give you an exposure to it so that you can have this as additional experience into your Lighthouse student learning experience. So Calgary again, hi. We've got Prab right now on the remote Slack channel monitoring your questions. And Prab will give us a heads up when there's a question coming in. So just type your questions in there, and Crispy's on tech support. Thanks, Crispy. Okay, thanks, Johnny.
Thank you. All right, and there's someone over there making noise. I don't know what they're doing. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, iOS guys, you can join in.
Come on in. All right, I'm Johnny Hermann, and I actually know what you're going through because I went through the iOS bootcamp a year ago, and I know some of you are coming up on exams, so that's very stressful. I'm very aware of that, and also doing midterm projects. So I know what you're going through. This talk on Agile, some of you may have been exposed to, some maybe not, is intended to assist possibly with your assignments actually, but definitely with your life as you leave from here, especially for those who've never actually been in a software company, say. Agile is kind of the modern way of doing software. There are still older ways of doing it, but which are used in certain domains, but you really can't get away from this now. And it comes in various forms, and we'll talk about that as we go. So that's a bit about me. I actually have been a software engineer and was a project manager / lean agile manager for many years. And I've recently got back into tech, like I said, with the iOS. So that's me in a nutshell. So I'm going to just quickly get a quick poll here. Knowledge of Agile. So hands up for those who Agile, it's obvious to you what that is, or at least you think it's obvious. Oh, I see sort of shaking a head there. It's obvious after the fact. Once somebody says, oh yeah, that's what it is, blah, 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 I know what it means. Never heard of it at all. So nobody's really heard of it. Okay. Don't know it at all. Most people don't care at all. Okay. Good. Okay. I'm going to have some bunch of quotes here. They're not important in and of themselves, but they do kind of lead into the topics I'm talking about. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. Albert Einstein. So who's heard of Waterfall? Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Eh? Even today, you've heard of Waterfall. You kind of maybe know what it is, and Agile's not necessarily that well known. So this is a famous diagram that is classically used since the 1950s for what's called Waterfall. It's sort of the basic way that people would go and make software if you came from an engineer's perspective, like classical engineering, like where you actually make bridges or whatever. And so they tried to apply that to software, and they said, okay, well, let's make system requirements, and then software requirements, and then do the analysis, then design the program, and then do the coding, and then test it, and then put it into operation. And then if something goes wrong down here, okay, then we got to figure out what to do, and that would take, actually this cycle would often take years, like it would be 3 years or something. I mean, I'm still around from a time when Microsoft Windows would take like years to come out. In fact, I was an intern there, and yeah, it took a long time. The irony of this paper was that the actual guy who wrote it, Winston Royce, he said right down here, not far from the very initial diagram, he says, I believe in this concept, but the implementation described above is risky and invites failure. So the weird thing about people is that they sort of saw the diagram and they're like, okay, and then it's stuck in their heads since the 1950s, like that's how we're supposed to make software. So the moral of the story here is read the fine print, I guess. But yeah, but fortunately, since then, we've realized that change happens all the time and new ways of working have come out. One of those key things that really started this going when I was a software engineer even was something called extreme programming. And you may have heard of this, and there's no exam on this. You're not expected to memorize all of the whirlwind of information I'm going to give to you, but it's good to know that it exists, and you can read up more on your own. Anyway, extreme programming was about taking everything you do as a programmer and doing it to the extreme and very quickly, very fast. So if you're going to do programming, do it with a group of people and just pair program and get it done, and then move on to testing or whatever. So these kind of the feedback loops, and you'll see that that's kind of a theme in general with Agile, which is tighten your feedback loops. With whatever, any person you're talking with, tighten that feedback loop. With a customer, tighten the feedback loop. With your coworker, tighten that feedback loop. With your product manager or your manager, tighten that feedback loop. Transparency and continuous communication is critical. In the 90s, along came this thing called Scrum, which is probably the most famous form of Agile practice. And this is the famous diagram that everybody uses. And the idea is you have a big chunk of work called the backlog, or your product that the manager dumps on your desk. And the idea is to carve off a chunk for a 2-week sprint, what's called a sprint. Carve off that chunk and only work on that chunk. And don't bother the team in the meantime with any of this other fancy stuff. And then every day, talk to your teammates about what's going on and see if you need some help. And then you produce potentially shippable product increments. So that piece of software is actually, in theory at least, shippable. It's done. It's been tested. It's got all the databases. It's got everything it needs in there, all the tiers, all the tech. And then once that's done, you create another sprint by carving off another chunk and go into that loop again. And you just do that indefinitely. By the way, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to ask them. You can also ask them at the end. And I'll be around afterwards if you want to. If you feel too shy about whatever, that's totally fine. In 2001, a bunch of very smart people came together and created what's called the Agile Manifesto. And so the Agile Movement started around that time. Highly recommend that you read this document. It may seem outdated, but it is sort of the foundational trigger that created the movement, and highly debated, controversial even to this day, like even these basic values here. I'm not going to read them. One thing to note, though, is there is a link that's below this, which most people forget, that leads to 12 principles. So it's about values and principles. So I'll leave that to your leisure. We'll cover a lot of what it talks about, but it's just too much to read right now. It really was a grassroots movement, though, to bring together QA and development and business analyst type people who traditionally were in silos. And you'll hear this word silo a lot. You really want to break down those silos. Okay? And so that's what Agile was about. In 2009, this DevOps movement and continuous delivery movement came along. And that's sort of a general diagram that you see when you hear about DevOps. And that's called the 3 ways, and it has to do with systems thinking, amplifying feedback loops, and a culture of continuous experimentation and learning. So that's what these sort of, within the bigger loop, you've got multiple loops along the way. Constant feedback is the general thing. This was to extend Agile by saying, okay, not only do we need the devs and the QAs and the business analysts talking to each other, but we need that other group of operations to also be working with us together on a daily basis. And so now this movement is really about breaking down that extra silo. And those 2 silos are important to really bring together. And the reason for that is because the development team builds things, and their fundamental mandate is change, really. Create new product, make changes. But on the other side of the fence, if you want to call it, is the operations group. And their fundamental mandate is stability and keeping the systems running. And so those naturally will create a friction point, and so a friction wall, really. And traditionally, that's been a big barrier. And so this movement was all about breaking down that barrier and the practices that come along with it. Okay, so before I get into Agile, one other thing I want to mention about just the sort of the layout of this this presentation. I'm going to talk for about half an hour. I'm going to try and get all that out there, and then we're going to do an exercise, and that's going to take about the second half hour. Okay, and that includes the folks in Calgary. And I have some slides just sort of show how we're going to do that. That doesn't mean you have to memorize what I'm saying now. I'll walk you through all of that, but I just wanted to give you a heads up as to where we're going with this. You're not off the hook. It's not just me doing work here for 1 hour straight. Okay, Agile. So when I say Agile, what is that? Some people say it's the manifesto. Some people say it's Scrum. And you really want to be careful that you don't equate it with the doing of the practices, because it's not that. It really is a way of being. And so it's really a mindset. It's about being Agile, not doing it. Now, sometimes to become Agile, you have to kind of do it a bit before you know what you're really up to. And then you kind of get a feel for what the values really meant. And there's lots of ways to get into doing that. And we can talk about that. And we will do that in the exercise. But it is values, principles, practices, and tools. It's fundamentally about iterating over and over again on your product so that you can give that feedback to your management about what's done by showing them what's done rather than talking about it, right? You actually show them working software. Tighten the feedback loops. Some people equate it to the scientific method applied to products, especially software. So you have a hypothesis. You're going to test that. What is the hypothesis? The software does this, or the customer wants that. And then you make some quick software and show it to the customer. And then they do or don't like it, gather some data, and iterate. OK, now let's change our experiment and do another experiment. And I mentioned Waterfall before. It's not the opposite of Waterfall. Those two can actually work in hybrid, and most of the real life, quote unquote, world is some kind of hybrid with Waterfall and Agile. The other thing is, I want to just throw this out there, I'm not right about all of this. There's a lot of contention out there. You can go on the internet and see all the debates about all of this. This is my take on Agile after, let's say, 10 years of doing this. So that doesn't make me right, okay? This is just to expose you to my opinion about it and some stats. Speaking of stats, there are no good stats about showing whether Agile, how good Agile really is. It's more anecdotal. Recently, in the last couple of years, there's been some good stuff. Scott Ambler has got some stuff out there, so you can look him up. The Chaos Manifesto by the Standish Group in 2012 is a sort of this case that they did, and it's often referenced. But I put a big question mark there because the methodology has been questioned, and they've been questioned about their statistics. But my gut tells me that this is approximately right about how good Agile is. But if you look closely here, it's not like it's fantastic, right? I mean, software projects have traditionally failed like astronomically bad. We're talking like 90% kind of thing. Here, with Waterfall, I'm talking like hacking and just doing whatever you want. Here, Waterfall, 57% of projects fail, 29 or basically don't meet the criteria. 29 outright are canceled or failed, and only about 14% succeed. Agile, still 50% are still questionable, and another 9% are still failed. But 42% of them would be considered success, which is approximately 3 times as good as the Waterfall. But it's sort of like the least of all evils, if you know what I mean. It's not like it's perfect. And that usually comes to, people tend to then blame Agile or blame the process. It's not the process. It's about how the environment has been set up around the people doing the work, okay? And so the Agile movement, really lean Agile movement, is really about creating an environment for people to work, modern environment for people to work in a harmonious way where you don't kill their morale and all that kind of stuff, right? Much more humanistic. Okay. Lots of benefits. I don't want to drone on about them, but basically, it allows you to, if you're going to go to Mars, and you're going to make a rover and go up there, you may want to use something a little more requirements driven and waterfall driven, where you have, because the turnaround time to fix a mistake, if you've gone to Mars, is, well, literally astronomical. I guess it's probably a good way of putting that. So yeah, and the turnaround time is like, I don't know, 8 minutes or something like that, just to communicate with the thing. So yeah, if you're doing that, then yes, by all means. But most software today doesn't require that rigor. And so you can and should use different methodologies, namely Agile. It has it's more transparent, you're more accountable. It's empiricism, so that means it's data-driven and evidence-based. It's reasonably predictable, actually, it may seem like, well, when it's a complex adaptive system, it's kind of just buzzing around, like how can you be predictable? But it turns out things can be predictable. Not the same way as old school kind of project management, but still, actually, it tends to be better. Incremental results oriented, sure. Minimize waste, real-time risk management. So people ask, well, where's the risk management in Agile? Like if you don't do proper formal risk management, where is it? Well, it turns out the way you do Agile by systematically and very frequently releasing software is a better way of managing your risk, because you actually are surfacing the issues faster and sooner and seeing whether they are validated by the market, like what your product is doing. Good for morale. It can be used beyond software development. There's something called, I think, Wiki Speed, where this modular car is being made using lean Agile techniques. So they actually iterate quickly on making a new car module for the lights or for the braking system or something like that. And if you've heard recently about the Tesla, it's a software-driven car. They can make enhancements to your shock absorbers, by a software update, right? So we're getting fast, very quickly into a world where iterating quickly is very important and adapting to the environment. Famous, well, he's not that famous, sorry. Maybe he's not famous at all. Not famous quote. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. The quote itself is somewhat famous. So that's, if you plan up front, you're probably going to realize that all the effort you put into that might have been a lot of wasted time. So what you really want to do is tighten that feedback loop with the customer and quickly talk with them about what they really need and show them stuff. This is kind of traditional project management, iron triangle constraints, if you've ever seen that from project management. Basically, you've got features, cost, and schedule, and you're going to constrain, Waterfall traditionally constrains the features or the scope and says, please estimate the cost and the schedule. So what ends up happening there is people will estimate, people are really bad at estimating, they'll throw more people at the problem, trying to get that scope done. But the problem is the most variable thing in this thing is the scope, generally speaking. You don't know literally what the software is going to be and what it needs to be for the customer base until you actually start building it. It sounds a little bit ironic, but it is kind of how it works. And so what Agile really kind of says is flip that. Flip the constraints. Don't hold the scope fixed. Hold the cost and the schedule fixed. Time box it, resource box it, and then in that chunk, deliver some scope. And then the question is, well, what scope? And that's what we're going to talk about more about today, and that's what the exercise is going to be about today. The scope you want to deliver is what probably some of you may have heard. It's called MVP. Does anybody know what that means? Minimal viable product, right? So that's a classic kind of buzzword now in the lean agile, lean startup movement. And so that's what we're going to practice today. And the idea is get it minimally viable and get it out there. Works or doesn't work, and then you can change it, keep iterating, iterating. Agile manages risk. I did mention this before, but basically the idea is if you have like one big release after a year, your risk curve is kind of increasing, or your realization that the risk is increasing only happens late. You only realize that the risks are like, wait a second, we needed this for dogs, not cats, whatever. So with Agile, if you're constantly incrementally delivering the value along the way, you're starting to realize, oh, it looks risky at the beginning. At least you try to think, okay, there are a lot of risks here because we're not going to ship something that's done. But at least you're producing it for customers and they're seeing it, and then you start to realize, oh, this is kind of what we want, and then you come in for a smoother landing than you would otherwise. I'm going to get into a little bit about what typical kind of roles you'll see, in the Agile world. There's the developer, which is basically you folks. So there's the developer. They use the word developer to also kind of mean any technical person regarding the production of the product. So that could be QA type people, testing people. Could be, it depends where you're at. I mean, it could be operations type people. It depends how your team is constructed. Yeah. So TransLinks even that's actually impressive. And for Calgary, TransLinks they're a transportation, well, I guess they manage it all, and the roads. So, yeah, absolutely. So you want to plan an advantage and adjust to the situation. So even Sun Tzu in The Art of War says, listen and then adjust, right? So leadership roles that you may come across, the traditional name is sort of product manager, but now product owner, and there's big debates about whether the one and the same or not, or one's a hat of the other. It goes on and on, right? There's a lot of debate, and people aren't necessarily right or wrong. It's a matter of just getting the gist of why these things exist and what the intention is. So the product owner is really worried about why we're doing something and what we're doing, and prioritizing that, and making sure we're doing the right thing first. To the best of their ability, right? There is no foreknowledge, magical foreknowledge about what we should be doing most of the time. If it was, then you're probably not in a very interesting space, right? So trade-offs there too. I mean, sometimes you can make good money in very boring spaces. So, but that's a whole other discussion. And you'll probably hear of something called a Scrum Master and Agile Coach. This is more. I've done both these roles, but I mean, this is more recently what I've been kind of doing. Bringing in someone who focuses on, like I was saying before, the environment around the team. Most people don't, a lot of the variability of what happens in a team has nothing to do with the people themselves, their intentions, bad behavior. I mean, all of that is usually predicated on the fact that the environment itself is just not set up for them to succeed. And that's what leaders are there for. They're there to create an environment for you to work well. So that's what this role is really dedicated to do. You'll often find a developer manager with this hat on, and then they're kind of spread so thin doing the tech, and because they're doing tech really well, they end up doing a lot more of that, and then they kind of ignore the people and the processes and everything else, and it doesn't do so well, and then the Scrum gets a bad name because we said, we tried that and it just didn't work. well, maybe it wasn't dedicated enough. So, walk in your customer's shoes. You want to empathize with your customer, keep an open dialogue. Definitely keep that feedback loop going. Something you will see is, so requirements or features are typically called stories in the Agile world. Like a story. Tell me a story about how this software is going to be used or what problem we're going to solve. Right? This is one of the classic ways of describing how to describe a story. It's a lightweight way of doing requirements. If you've ever seen, which you probably haven't, formal requirements documents, I can tell you they can be hundreds of pages long, and every single requirement has like 1 or 2 pages with preconditions, postconditions, like dependencies, and it goes on and on. And some environments do require that, right? But you don't need it for everything. So some bigger companies get a lot of momentum, and they just end up just doing that for everything, even in your innovation department. So you want to be careful about that. Keep it lightweight. But it does have a few key features, pieces of this that you want to pay attention to, and this is what we're going to be doing on our exercise later. So this is where we do want to sort of really pay attention. So as a particular persona, the persona is the kind of person who's going to be using the software. Oftentimes, if you're in this world of like mobile devices, it's going to be like the one user. So you can often just say like, as a user, right? But bigger software, sometimes you're like, well, as the transit operator, dispatcher guy, person, right? That role needs this software. A different persona might use the same software in a different way, so you may have different personas. But sometimes it's just as a user, and I often write my own like as a user. It's kind of cheating, but it doesn't matter. What really matters is that you say, I want to have a functionality so that I get certain value out of it. This is where you get this is the what and the why. So the functionality is what scope, what do I want to produce in this chunk of work, and what value we're going to get from this. If you can't come up with a value, you got to ask yourself, why am I doing this thing? And trust me, you'll be in companies where, because the moving parts are so many, and there's so many people who have requirements, it almost gets lost as to why we actually decided to eventually do this thing, right? So it's very important to always keep these associated, tightly associated, what you're doing and why you're doing it, if you can. I like this part of the story, and even if you don't end up doing this top part, you really should do the acceptance criteria, because there's something called scope creep, which you may have come across. Scope creep is very much an issue where, especially as engineers, we want to make good software, good quality software, and we always think, oh, it would be good if it had this other thing, right? And then, so the idea is it kind of creeps, but that doesn't mean people are going to pay you for that extra stuff, right? So you got to be careful about allowing too much extra software to creep in. So what acceptance criteria does is it allows you to have a stopping condition. How do I know when I'm done this thing, right? And so if you help specify that ahead of time, good, because then you've really kind of figured out, after we got this and this, I'm not going to do these 3 other things that could possibly burn some time that nobody really cares about. That's not to say you won't do it, but just have another story later, right? That's what allows you to be agile. You can adjust. Business value, some people put like metrics on business value and a size estimate, and this is where estimations come in points. If you've seen story points, you may hear something called story points. I've done both sorry, I'm probably creating a lot of fuzzy love for Calgary over there by hitting this mic. That was not intentional. Story points, very common way to estimate things. There's a big debate about whether you should or shouldn't, and that is definitely controversial. If you are interested you can go to the pound or # no estimates and just look up that debate. Other people think you should just do throughput of stories. So just measure the throughput and you'll get a good enough trend. So we'll come back to this. I have other slides for that in the future. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So this goes back to that minimally viable product, right? So I'm going to try and convince you now of ways to make minimally viable product possible. And I'm going to do that with this metaphor. So what's MVC stand for? Somebody?
Minimum viable cake.
Minimal viable cake. Someone's fast. But for you guys, it's model view controller. But yes, minimal viable cake is what it stands for in my world. So you have something to produce, software to produce. The recommendation for how you break your scope up, if you want to become minimally viable, is you don't need the multi-layered top, chocolate dusted polka dot cake right out of the gate most of the time. You don't need that full product. If you're going to try and do that, the idea is to slice it thin as possible vertically through the tiers. So if you have a database tier, a business object tier, a UI tier, don't go and spend 3 months doing your database tier, followed by your 3 months of doing your object tier, followed by 3 months of doing your GUI, and then discover the customer doesn't give a crap about any of it, right? So the idea is do a thin slice. That's not to say it's exactly this way, right? Sometimes you have to have like an architectural runway with a little bit of a horizon, a couple months out, maybe a sprint or two ahead, that kind of stuff. There's always trade-offs, right? I'm a very practical person, and you should be about this too. Try not to become a scrum-mentalist, as they say, right? Don't become an extremist about this kind of stuff, but don't throw it all out either, right? It's a trade-off, as with everything. So that is the main way that you'll hear in the world about how to make minimally viable software. You thin slice the stories, and those ones, you then have to decide how to prioritize them, and we can talk about that in a minute. But there's another degree of freedom here which most people forget, and sometimes it's hard to slice this, and you'll find it in the exercise. It's hard to slice it. You'll be like, well, I need this thing. I need this shopping cart. It's not useful without these other parts. Like, well, how minimally viable could it be if it doesn't have all these other bits? Well, so there's another degree of freedom, and so this is functional, and the other degree of freedom is called fidelity, okay? So you can have high fidelity, low fidelity, Wi-Fi, hi-fi, right? Low-fi. So high fidelity and low fidelity. So this is a low fidelity cake, right? And maybe all you need up front is low fidelity cake. Maybe you want to impress them with this, but if you deliver them that, you might actually get some business and you'll keep their ear long enough that they'll give you some money later because like, you know what, these folks know what they're doing. They know how to make some cake, right? So low fidelity, it's not the multi-layered chocolate, right? It's definitely lower fidelity. That doesn't mean, by the way, that doesn't mean low quality. Quality and fidelity are orthogonal to each other, right? You can have a high quality, low fidelity product and vice versa, okay? Some people mix that up. It's not low quality, it just means low fidelity. It's like computer screens used to be before retina displays, right? We used to have blocks moving around. Okay, so you can slice it this way, you can slice it this way. Do not avoid, this is the layers of the cake here. Avoid this, right? Avoid making one layer and then making the other layer and making the layers separate from each other and then eventually combining them together with some icing and then like presenting it in one big, launch at the end of the year after a year's worth of work and then realizing, you know what? Cake is just not it. All right. So I'm going to give you some examples of the company I work at. I work at a company called Peso. And we do payments transfer between mostly millennials, free using the banking infrastructure that you're used to. So we're not a bank, but we enable banking features better, hopefully, than banks themselves do. Banks are not that well known for being very iterative and interactive with the population, mostly. So that's what we do, but that's not the point. The point of this, I have some good examples from it that show what I'm talking about how to make a minimally viable product. So I'm going to go through these examples, and then we're going to do the exercise, and then I have some wrap-up notes. So this is thin slicing. So functional vertical slicing says, okay, we need to add some new functionality. Do we add this big thing, or can we make a thin sliced thing? And so our product, you could log into the product. It was kind of heavy. You had to log in every time. You have to log in with your phone number and your passcode. And if you wanted to log out, you didn't have to log out, but if you did log out, you'd have to come back to find the login page, put in your phone number, put in your passcode, and go, and it would have to do the login again to the back end. So we decided to add a feature called the lock screen. It sounds kind of obvious now, but we didn't have it at the time, right? So we added the lock screen. So that's what you see on the right here. So the idea was you hit lock, and boom, it just throws up a screen cover, and you cannot see what's behind it until you punch in your code. And so it's simply a quick way of adding a feature that didn't necessarily, it basically was new functionality. It was a very thin slice because all we did was put a simple screen in front of the other feature there. Now, fortunately, it was kind of thin on its own. I mean, we didn't have to think too much about it. We're like, you can't get much more minimally viable than that. Like, if I were to try and put the screen up but then not allow you to put the passcode, like, it's not minimally viable anymore. It's just not viable, at least. It's minimal, but it's not viable. All right. Does that make sense? That kind of making sense? Hands kind of in the air if it kind of makes sense. Kind of. Okay, actually, good.
I got a question.
Yeah, I have an answer.
So you're adding a lock screen to something that's a function, a login function. It's not expanding your scope already.
Good question. So the question was, is not adding a lock screen feature creep? When I say feature creep, what I mean is scope that trickles into a product that was not intended by the business and has no business justification. Remember when we talked about the story, you have to have the functionality and the value? associated with each other. Scope creep is typically features that kind of got into the product because engineers thought it was cool. It's not just engineers. I mean, sometimes salespeople come and talk to an engineer without talking to the product manager. I mean, companies really do have communication problems like that, right? So it could be that it's just not, it's functionality that's not really justified by any business means. There's plenty of cool software out there that has died on the shelf, right? That engineers thought this was like Laserdisc. Anybody remember Laserdiscs? Right, I mean, it's one of those examples, look it up. It's one of those examples where it was like superior technology and didn't succeed, right? VHS, videotapes, if people remember, beat out, a superior product. And mobile phones, I mean, RIM, look at Blackberries, right? They should have had a crazy lead on this smartphone and mobile device world, and they did for a while. They got taken out, right? So anyway, so good question. No, in this case, we consciously decided that there was value for our users to have a quick way of getting into their to have security, because it is a payments app. So your money's in there, right? I mean, there's people. If someone picked up your phone, you could use it by accident. Someone could use it, or either by accident or intentionally transfer money to themselves or something. The point was this was more laborious. You had to go hunt for the logs, the log out, and then log back in. So if something's not fast, they don't necessarily do it. So we needed something lightweight. So that was that. Now, having said that, this doesn't mean that, so once you've blocked the screen, you're not logged out. I mean, you still have data on the phone, so if you're worried about that, we have other ways of securing that, right? But some people are to varying degrees, more security conscious. So, good question. So, an example of the Fidelity, where we're taking an existing feature and taking it farther. So we had the lock screen now, but these iOS devices, at least mine, has a Touch ID on it. So that's the fingerprint reader at the bottom, biometrics reader. And so it didn't really add anything. It was bonus to put that on there, but it made it more efficient for the user, right? So now they don't have to remember the password or type it. They can simply just put their thumb on the base of their phone there, and boom, it logs them back in, or it unlocks the screen. So that's an example of Fidelity. So it's a higher fidelity version of this. It does more than it would have done before. This was minimally viable in the sense of being able to lock the screen, but this made it a higher fidelity version of it. Better user experience. Another example of Fidelity, you often see this on your iOS apps. If you, certain permissions, it'll ask you certain permissions for your contacts or for your location. It'll say, it's a system prompt, right? Those prompts, you can't avoid them as an iOS developer. You have to use those prompts to get there. But it can be sometimes surprising to a user, especially when you're asking. It may not be that obvious. And really, you should try and design your app to show, like, this is the point at which I want to ask you about your contacts. So this is what it looked like before. You were just logging in, and right when you logged in, it would immediately ask you, we would like to ask your contacts. And it's not that obvious. And like, I just got here. Why are you asking me for all these permissions? And some people just automatically say no. The problem with that is, of course, then you have to tell them where to go later to go and turn it back on and all that stuff, right? So instead of that, we preempt them with a higher fidelity experience by saying, okay, we're going to put a page in front of that and say, as you hit login, boom, it says, we want contact with it. So it's friendly, little bobbleheads, whatever, right? So something that tells you, this is why we're going to do it. We're not going to spam you. You can disconnect this anytime. And you say, okay, I got it. And then we show the system prompt, right? And then you're not so scared, or you're not so primed to say, oh, system prompt, okay, I'm just going to say don't allow, right? Now you're more primed to kind of say, okay, I'm okay with that now because they set me up, right? They set the expectation. Functional and fidelity slicing. So we have this feature called Friends on Peso. And so now, because you give us access to your contact list, we can actually check ahead of time who of those people are already users on Peso. And if you don't know them, if they're not on Peso, you can invite them and all this kind of other good stuff. But regardless of that, if you come into your contact list, you will see that we actually know who the Peso users are, and they get shuffled to the top. So you can actually quickly start, sharing with them, communicating with them, sending payments back and forth, requesting payments from each other. In addition to that, and so we actually then also show those users on the front page of the app. So this was additional functionality. We wanted to show, like, we know that these users are Peso users, so we're going to start an empty conversation with those users on your homepage, so you can actually start to have a conversation with them if you want. We could debate right here or now whether you think that's a useful feature, but that's not the point of this. I think it's useful, but you could also be argued that it's going to be crowded. But that's something you test against the market, right? The point is we implemented it quickly, and now we can test it. So that's a functional additional. We added more scope there. There was a feature there that didn't exist before. And you could tell, in theory at least, how many users are already, who your friends are already on Peso. But the higher fidelity version of this is the very first time you log in and sign up, we say, boom, we give you a little, what I call the noodle bar, like the noodle box down here. And the noodle bar here with the, you have 9 friends already on Peso. And so that's kind of a higher fidelity experience of what already existed. You could determine how many were on there if you wanted to count it up, but this is kind of like, you've got 9 friends on there. And you'll note that we made a very conscious decision to not ever write the words, you have 0 friends, right? So we just don't show the noodle bar in that case. We recommend, we recommend other things. Okay. Another vertical slice is, you've probably seen this on your app here with the badge where it says how many messages. So our chat feeds, they'll be unread, they'll be bolded and unread and pushed to the top. We actually count how many unread feeds you have, and we put it into our little badge here. When you're in a particular conversation, you can see if you go back, there's one conversation waiting for you over there. And then on your home, on your app icon, you'll see there's one conversation waiting in Peso for you to go and look at. So that's a additional piece of functionality. If you do get a notification, if you do get a message or a payment from someone, we would do what's called a push notification. You've probably seen these before. You're getting the notifications from your email or your calendar or whatever that come down into your system level notifications. If you happen to have the app open, though, you don't see those notifications by definition, at least on iOS. By definition, you don't see those notifications. And so we decided to do it in the app. So this is a higher fidelity version of the feature by basically giving you, you could see, because the number in the top left, the badge would go up, go from 1 to 2 or something like that, but it wasn't quite the fidelity we wanted. So we created a higher fidelity version of that. Okay, it's 2:35, 25 minutes. I suggest we stand up and take 1 minute break if you need a break, bio break, and then we'll come back and do the assignment. Ooh, the exercise. Okay, so 1 minute break. And I wish I had like a timer here, but I don't. But so I'll just I'll draw your attention. Gather round, gather round. Okay, so by now, hopefully this is somewhat recognizable. So this is one of the standard formats for writing a user story, quote unquote. So what we're going to do is, I want you guys, for your existing project, the one you're working towards, or the one you've done in the past, whichever one makes it less stressful for you, we're going to write one story. So just pick a feature, one feature of your product, and write a story for it, okay? And so what it should include, it should say, as a user, if you only have one user, just a user. If you have 3 users, put the user you're talking about so we know what context, you're setting up the context. I want this feature, whatever, add to shopping cart, or show me on the maps, or whatever it is that your app does, okay? so that, and what's the value? What does the user get out of this? What do business people get? What does the company get out of it? There's got to be some value statement about why we're doing this thing. Because again, if it doesn't, right, per this question over here from before, it could just be scope creep. You're just adding scope for no apparent reason, right? Okay? So, and then put acceptance criteria. It's kind of arbitrary how many. I've seen acceptance criteria where there's like 7, 8, 9, 10 even. It's debatable whether those should possibly, if you start to get that many acceptance criteria, maybe it deserves to be sliced, the thin slice that story some more. And we will do that as the next part of this exercise. So don't worry about that too much for now. Just write a story and put some acceptance criteria on it. And I can come around and just ask, I can help out if you need help. Maybe if you could monitor the Slack in case people have questions during this period. But we'll spend about 5 minutes doing this for this story, and then we'll go on and make it, we'll try and do some slicing on the story, okay? So it's important that you write a story now because we're going to slice the same story as we go along, okay? And if, the other thing I forgot to mention, if you want to work in pairs or groups, that's totally fine. It might save some time as well, right? So if you're already in a group, just work in that group and discuss amongst yourselves. I'm going to go on the mic here. Just attention for a second here. Sorry, when I say value up there, I don't mean like dollar value per se. You don't have to come up with like the numeric, how many dollars this thing is worth. I mean, like, why are we doing this? Think of it like, here's the value we're getting out of this. It has a purpose. What is the purpose of this feature? Don't just re-describe the feature like it's a button that does, you know what I mean? That's the functionality piece of it. But I'm not expecting you to have a metric on this. Like, maybe I should have been clear about that. So that was a good question that came up right over here. So thank you. Keep those questions coming. And back to you. And we'll be back in a minute or two. So. Okay, folks. So I hope I'm on. So I'm on, right? Yeah, okay. All right, so attention, everybody. I do need like one of those rapid tap tap things. Hello. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so hopefully you've managed to write up a user story here. If you haven't, don't worry about it. You can continue on as we continue. I just want to get enough time to get through everything. So hopefully you've got a story that says, as a user, I want this particular piece of functionality so that I get some kind of benefit out of this thing, right? Hopefully you have some acceptance criteria that says, well, if it's blue and you click the button and it goes to this page, I know it's done minimally viably, speaking at least. It does the minimum thing I needed to do. Yes, it may have a bunch of other stuff it's going to do. You don't have to specify literally everything, because if you specify literally everything, you might as well write the software, right? Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do the vertical slicing on this thing, okay? This is going to be tough, I know. It's very common to write a story that's what's called too big, or called an epic. And so if you hear this word epic, it's kind of large, and it's probably too large to produce in, say, half a day's worth of coding. Stories you really want to make small. You want to make them small enough so it's maybe a day. Because a day, when you leave and come back, if you let something go multiple days, it's like, was that 3 days now or 2 days? It starts to become much more blurry. If you can fit a chunk of work into a size of a day, that's kind of where you want to be at. So most stories, when people first start writing them, are like epic level. There's like, I want a website that allows me to shop for books, and I can check out, and I can do all this, right? It does like everything, like really. So take your existing story and write another story. It's relative to this, and what you're going to do is break that story down by thin vertically slicing it. And if you want to think about that as the cake, right? It's this cake where you're vertically slicing through whatever layers you have and just making a thinner version of what you think you were going to do, okay? I realize this is painful, but it's a good exercise. You need to get used to doing this kind of thing, because by doing this, you create predictability for your management. And if you do that and create transparency for your management and your leadership, they don't constantly micromanage you and try and figure out what the heck you're doing, because you're constantly producing stuff for them, right? Working software, hopefully. Okay, so as a persona, I want thin functionality, right? So thinner than what you had. Break it down. If you're having trouble with that, just start on another story and try and make it as thin as possible, okay? So that, and it's going to probably have similar value, right? The key thing is that it's got to be thinner. It may also be, then you'll notice that it maybe has half the acceptance criteria, because there was so much acceptance criteria for the previous story. It naturally just lends itself to being split. And so the exercise of writing stories in and of itself can help you with the exercise of making the stories thinner, okay? So, yes, question?
Yes.
I got an answer.
Take the example for peso. It seems very simple already. Like, I want to send money to a person, right?
Yes.
So how would you slice that even thinner? Like, you're only accomplishing one thing.
One thing. Okay. Yes, so we have, the question was, using peso as an example, how do I split a feature such as sending money to my friends? How do I slice that thinner? Okay, so that's a great question. Right now, our app, we have a chat feature. And the chat feature, in the chat, you can actually go and make a payment to each other, and it shows up in your chat feed. So not only are transactions happening, the chat messaging actually occurs in the flow of your chat conversation. That wasn't the original thing. That actually was a sliced off story that we did separately from the payments themselves. And if you were around long enough before Peso had chats, we actually had functionality to do payments first. Chatting has been on our minds about what we wanted to do, but it would be too epic for us to jump in and do chats and payment, like the actual payments within the chat feed, all at the same time. Once we write that out and you think about it a bit more, you're like, wait a second, we could probably just do payments in a simpler way with like a button just to do payments. It has nothing to do with being in a chat conversation or anything like that. Let's just do the chat. I keep saying chat. Let's just do the payment by picking a person, an amount, and say pay, right? The chat thing can come later, and it did come later. It actually came after the fact. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Calgary.
Yeah. Are developers responsible for writing user stories?
Good question. Are developers responsible for writing user stories? I would say the product owner is the person who pretty much usually writes the stories. Having said that, though, everybody is accountable for the existence of the stories and the refinement of those stories. And absolutely, developers are responsible for coordinating with the product manager in a tight feedback loop to make sure that that story is mutually acceptable, if that makes sense. This is not a dictation from management engineers. This is there's actually a nice way of putting this, which the Agile community does talk about. A story is a promise to have a future conversation. It's a promise to have a future conversation between the engineers and management, and between QA and all the other involved parties, and product managers and business folks and everybody who has a stake in making this product happen. This is a promise that distills down the key thing about what we're doing, but it's a promise to say, let's go and refine this again. And there's a whole other part of this that I didn't really get into, which is if you have a backlog of stories, which is a long list of these stories and they're prioritized and all that, there's this exercise called refinement. It used to be called grooming. I don't know, people don't like the word grooming, so that's called refinement. Anyways, so you refine this backlog every so often, and what you're doing there is having a conversation with everybody in the room, the key stakeholders, business people, and techies, and refining how these are written. So it's no one person. In Agile, there is no individual success or failure. It's a team-based, I should have mentioned that before, it's a team-based effort. Everybody succeeds or fails together. We rise and fall together as a team. And you should be treated that way as a team. No, there are no real heroes in the modern kind of software age. I mean, there are a few, but they often get fired, frankly. So it's just a so anyway, that's a whole other story I don't want to get into. But you don't want to be the cowboy. It's about teamwork, right? And that means everybody's responsible for the stories. Whether you literally write them or not is not the heavy lifting, by the way. The heavy lifting is the thinking about what goes into it and do we agree and, so. Great question. Fantastic question, actually. So, exercise. Unless someone else has more questions. So, yeah. Is this a way of avoiding the exercise? Is that what this is? Like this? No, go ahead.
I just had a comment about your question earlier. The question was, Peso just does one thing. Like, I want to send money to my friends. What more is there to it? There's always so much more to it. Like, how do you log in? How do you load your bank account? Right? I'm
Yeah.
sure you could talk
Yeah. So the comment was.
without the chat. Like,
Yeah.
it would have been really hard.
So the comment here was, even without the chat, Peso, it appears superficially at least to be a single purpose app. And yes, it's single purpose, but that doesn't mean there aren't lots of features. So the person here is saying there's plenty of other things that have to happen to make that a success. I mean, how do you know who your friends are? How do I know who you are? Is that your money that you're transferring? I mean, all of that stuff has to be taken into account and has to be handled in some way. And each of those would be first epic stories, but then broken down into actual doable things so that you could produce some software every day approximately. So that's, if you are doing Scrum, you'd have every 2 weeks kind of a shippable increment. Maybe low fidelity, may not have all the features, but it kind of does what you want. You can show that to business people. Salespeople can demo that thing. The marketing people can start marketing and working on that with what's real. Because I can tell you, what happens with a silent engineering organization after 3 months, 6 months, or whatever, the salespeople and the marketing people start inventing stuff on their own. And then what happens is they sell something you don't have, they market something you don't have, and then they come back to you and ask you, why don't you have this magical software that we suddenly came up with? Again, tighten the feedback loops no matter what you do, right? Tighten the feedback loops with all the stakeholders. Good, so exercise, thinner functionality. and we'll give that another couple of minutes, okay? So try your best to take the existing story you have and make it thinner. That means chopping off some of it. Make it more minimally viable. There's got to be something you can produce from the original story that's just less than that, but still does something interesting. So another minute or two, and then I'll come back. Okay, folks, let's reconvene here. We're coming up on the hour, so I want to try and just get through the last bit of this and give some notes, and then we can go. So I have to be done in a few minutes here. Okay, so last part here would be Fidelity. And I want you to just think about this on your own. We're not going to have time to actually do the exercise, but after this, go through the exercise. It's healthy for you guys to think about this. How would I make a lower fidelity version of what I just put down on paper? Like, does it mean like black and white maps instead of color maps? Does it mean, if whatever your scenario is, try and think a lower fidelity version of what it is. And the example I like to use, I mean, other than the cake, is if you think about roads. So Gastown over there, we've got this cobblestone road thing. It may turn out that that was actually expensive to do. I don't know. But it's kind of a lower fidelity road. So you got to ask yourself, do you need that? Do you need the Formula One racetrack? Or do you need Highway 1? Or do you need the asphalt road out here? Or can you get away with the cobblestone road? Right? Those are levels of fidelity. They can have high quality, but maybe one is a lot less to produce, a lot cheaper to produce, a lot faster to produce, and maybe it does the job. And maybe people are willing to pay you $1 million for that. If you get $1 million in a month versus $1 million in 3 months or a year, then you're doing good business, right? Okay, so we don't have time to go through that, but basically the story would be, as a persona, I want some lower fidelity version of the story so that I can have this value, and maybe the value is the same value, but it just is not as doesn't expect as much. There was a good question while we were doing that exercise. How many acceptance criteria do you need? I would say a handful, up to a handful. There shouldn't be 0, and I would say if you go beyond 5, you maybe start thinking your story might be epic, or too big at least, too big of a story, and that might justify splitting it one way or the other, vertically or with fidelity. Split it up. The acceptance criteria are really a safety mechanism between you and for scope creep. We talked about scope creep before. Because what's your stopping condition, right? There's an infinite number of cool things that could happen to your software, and you're not the only source of scope creep, right? There could be managers, salespeople come to you, and they're like, I thought that this website was going to include this, that, and the other, right? And it's fuzzy, and they're not wrong, right? It's just it was never specified, right? And this is where people get in that trap of, well, let's fully specify it, and let's create a requirements document, right? You can avoid that by iterating very frequently and making sure that the acceptance criteria are captured in your stories. And if you have to have that conversation with someone who's like, this doesn't include everything that I need, then say, we're going to create another story, and we're going to break off those acceptance criteria. Okay? Okay. If you have trouble with prioritizing, I call it the one thing priority trick. You've got to think, if we ran out of time and money tomorrow, and you can even say this to manager type people if they're having trouble figuring out priority, because they'll like to say, these 5 things are the top priority, and then something that comes tomorrow is also top priority. There's only one universal ranking. The stories do not have equal ranking. There's one above the other in that backlog, okay? Any tool you look at will pretty much show that. So if you ran out of time and money tomorrow and you can only get literally one thing, what is it? And then that's the top priority item. And if you have time to do more, you say, go back to step 1. Okay, of the remaining things, if you can only get one thing, what is that? And it's weird. It sounds simple, but it's weird. It puts someone in a perspective, who, especially business folks who have a lot of things juggling in their head. It forces them to sit and think for a second, okay, if I literally only got one thing tomorrow, what would it be? It's a very healthy way of kind of pushing back on managers, whoever, like, who want the impossible, which is what they always want, right? So, okay, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Edward Deming, if you want to read about lean and stuff like that, he pretty much, is one of the godfathers of lean. Yeah, basically you want empiricism. I'm not going to get into this, but this has to do with like creating a system rather than individuals. You don't want to locally optimize on one individual or locally optimize on one feature of the product. You want to look at the whole system and all of the processes and procedures around the team to make that team work effectively. Don't shoot the messenger. Don't revert to a lizard brain where you're like, that guy did it. Just assume they all meant well. People meant well. Again, most problems are due to the environment, not the people. And there's something else I could talk about, which I won't, which is fundamental attribution error. You can look that up. It has to do with people basically thinking that the problems that they have are due to the environment, but when you look at someone else, you're like, it's that guy. He's the problem first. It has nothing to do with the environment, even though you're both in the same team or the same environment, right? It's a natural bias that we have. And we have 200 plus biases, by the way. We're not perfect beings. That's a backlog if you want to see, if you ever want to see one. This is Jira product. Backlog, stories, universal ranking. There's nothing at the same level, right? There is one top item. We're working on that until it's done. Maybe you have 2 or 3 people, so maybe you got the top 2 or 3 stories in progress in any particular moment, right? But we're not working on this item down here when these guys aren't done. Does that make sense? Cool. You'll also see a workflow board. This is kind of like during the sprint or the release. We've got to do, in progress, in review, and done. That's kind of just making sure that we are making progress and people can see that we're actually making progress. Another way of visualizing that progress is to see what's called a burn down chart. You'll see this out in the real world. You kind of want to see, this is the recommended line, if given the time you have. This red line you want to kind of bounce down. You'll see scope got added, but then we replace it with other scope, and then you kind of want this to bounce down this line. That's basically a healthy kind of team. If this thing goes sideways and it's just becoming a cliff, you know it's bad. You know that we're not producing anything, we don't know what, and that's not to blame anybody. That is a trigger for a conversation. And you really need to trigger a conversation when the red goes behind this legend of the map here. If it goes behind that legend, you know you're in trouble, okay? There should be like a big red alert that comes off. Okay, Lean Kanban has this other thing called control chart. If you're interested in any of this stuff, connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find out all of that. I'm happy to talk about all of that. Some advice, always deliver valuable working product. Vary your scope by fidelity, not just functionality. If you feel you don't have enough degrees of freedom to change what you're doing, give them the cobblestone road, not the Formula One racetrack, right? Give them that low fidelity cake. Limit your work in progress, that's a lean thing. Maintain a constant pace indefinitely. Don't kill yourself. I know in here you're killing yourself, that's a different story, right? And there will always be crunch time. When you're working at a company, there's always crunch time. But most of the time, keep an even keel, okay? Use simple checklists, okay, whatever. Okay. Transparency is painful, don't kill a messenger. And again, if you want to remember anything, remember these cakes, okay? Vertical slicing, still, even if it's high fidelity, do a thin vertical slice. If you can make it lower fidelity, do it. Whatever you do, don't make the database for 3 months and then make the business, like nobody's going to want to pay you to produce that kind of stuff, unless you're going to Mars, all right? Okay, some resources, whatever. Stay agile, my friends. And if you have questions, by all means, come and talk to me afterwards here. If there's anything else on Slack, also, if there's any questions on there now, I don't know. No questions now? Okay, good. My LinkedIn is here. It's pretty straightforward. Johnny Hermann, basically, just look me up, and I'll be happy to connect with you. And if you have any questions now or on LinkedIn or at any point in the future, by all means, reach out to me. I love talking about this stuff and educating people and bootstrapping teams. So, all right. Thank you. Oh, wait, we do have a question. Calgary has a question.
How do we estimate how long it will take to build a feature in Agile?
Yeah. So in Agile, estimation is the question was, how long or how do we estimate a feature in Agile? How do we know how long it's going to take? Especially because managers often ask you, how long is it going to take? Okay. If you are in an environment that is very logistical and traditional, so say you're building something that's been built many times before, usually there is databases of evidence of teams that have done this before, or even your team that's done this before, and how long it takes to do something like pave a road or whatever it is, put bricks up. Okay? If you're in that environment, you probably have that data hanging around, and that's great. And it's probably stable data. So you can pretty much use that. Whatever you do, try and avoid individual people just gut feeling it. Because yes, there are environments where people have been around for 20 years, and that may work, and if it's a logistical environment. But what happens normally is that it's another human bias where we are very optimistic. We estimate things very positively. We only think about the happy path, first of all. And when we do think about the happy path of the software, and that's like, usually there's like many orders of magnitude of unhappy paths that have to be coded and accounted for and make sure the thing doesn't die, right? The software doesn't die. We think about the happy path, and then we underestimate that on top of it all. We're really bad estimators, humans are. So Lean came up with this, has come out of the empirical process control. And so the idea there is take data, but it has to be real data of your team doing work. If you make these stories small enough, and they basically are close in size to each other, if you work for 2 or 3 sprints and just measure how long it takes for those stories to go through, or if you're using story points, that's great, then your story points kind of gives you a trending mechanism. Once you have that trending mechanism, when you want to estimate some kind of new chunk of work, you, first of all, try and break it down again to be similar in size to the work you already did, right? Because you can't apply some metric to something that's not relevant to the same kind of size, right? It's got to be somewhere in the same range. 1 or 2, 3 days, something like that, chunks. And that's an experience thing. You got to start doing it. Give yourself a time box period of time, like 2, 3 sprints or something, to build up a kind of a team metric trending model. And then once you have that, then you can apply those same estimations, and you actually trigger conversations in estimation sessions. When you have an estimation session with your team, like, well, yeah, but you think that thing's really twice as big as that other thing? It's more relative, right? Agile talks about relative estimation. I don't want to get into all that right now, but really, it's about relative to this other work we just did. Yesterday's weather is pretty much, it helps you predict or forecast what's going to happen in the near future. Not long, don't estimate 3 months or 6 years into the, that's crazy. 1 or 2, maybe 3 sprints maximum into the future. If you're, notice how I said you have to break down the stories. It takes effort to go break those stories down. When is all that action happening, right? If you're doing that on the fly all the time too, there's a lot of effort going into a backlog that may never happen, right? Because once you've implemented 2 stories, you may pivot or agilely go in a different direction from what your backlog currently says. So there's a trade-off here, right? There's a trade-off between how much you bother to break down and estimate and predict versus actually delivering the software and get the evidence of whether this is even the right direction. So, long-winded story, but I mean, how do you estimate? It's a very contentious topic. You can read all about it. I recommend avoiding estimation. I am on the no estimates bandwagon, so to speak. I'm in that camp. It doesn't make me right. You have to be, sort of disciplined to make sure you are having the conversations you need to have that would be triggered by an estimation session. But if you have a mature team and your stories are pretty well right-sized with each other, just use the throughput of your stories. And we get 5 stories per week or whatever it is on average, and the stories are pretty much the same size. Well, you're going to get 5 more stories. And so it's not a matter of like, you want to be careful because old school like management used to say, here's the estimate, and now did you meet your estimate, right? If you're in that kind of environment, that's really old school, and we want to try and in general, we want to get away from that because that adds no value to working software, right? The chief metric of, it's in the Agile Manifesto, the chief metric to use when you're, producing software in an Agile environment is the working software itself in front of the customer or your business person, the customer proxy, right? Yeah. There's entire books written on estimation if you really want to do it. Again, I recommend trying to go with throughput if you can ahead of time, but that does require you to break down the stories into a reasonably consistent size. It will have variability, right? But that just has to stay in a control band. That's it. for it to be valuable and predictable. So, okay. Other questions? From Calgary? No? Okay, I'm going to sign off. I'm slightly over, but yes, thank you very much and appreciate it. Connecting. And bye, Calgary.